The light was lying to him, and Raymond Whitaker knew it. Rain came sideways off the Pacific in sheets that stung like buckshot, and the schooner Northern Star pitched so hard beneath his boots that the deck seemed to want to throw him into the black water itself. Somewhere off the starboard bow, through the driving murk, the beacon at Blackwater Point flashed once, twice, then died. A heartbeat later it flared again in a rhythm no chart, no almanac, no keeper's manual had ever described. "That ain't the pattern, Captain," First Mate Jed Coombs bellowed over the shriek of the wind, his knuckles white on the wheel. "Blackwater flashes every 8 seconds, steady as a hymn." That there is chaos. Raymond had run this coast for 11 years. He had buried his own brother's bones in a sailor's grave off Point Arena, and he had promised himself on that black day that he would never again trust a light he did not understand. And yet the reef was there, unseen beneath the froth, waiting to open the Northern Star's hull like a tin can, and somewhere on that cliff a lantern was blinking out a message written in no language he had ever learned. "Hold her steady," he shouted, though his own heart hammered a warning against his ribs. He lifted the spyglass, salt water streaming down the brass, and through the tempest he caught it. Not the mechanical, clockwork sweep of a Fresnel lens turning on its track, but a handheld lantern swinging in short arcs, then long ones, then short again. 3 short, 2 long, a pause, 3 short. It was a signal, not chaos at all. Someone was daring to speak to him through the storm in a code only a sailor bred to darkness and semaphore would recognize, and whoever held that lantern was not the keeper he had been told to expect. "Hard to port," Raymond roared, gambling everything on a stranger's message scrawled in fire against a dying sky. "Hard to port now, or so help me God." The wheel screamed. The Northern Star groaned like a wounded animal and swung her bow away from a black tooth of rock that broke the surface not 40 feet from where her keel had been aimed only seconds before. White water exploded against the reef, a hungry, hissing sound that Raymond would hear in his dreams for the rest of his days. They had missed it. By the width of a woman's outstretched hand, they had missed it. He fell to one knee on the slick planking, breath tearing out of him in ragged relief, and lifted the glass once more toward the point. The lantern was gone. In its place, steady and true, the great lamp of Blackwater light resumed its proper turning, 8 seconds on, 8 seconds dark, as though nothing at all unusual had happened on that lonely finger of rock jutting into a killing sea. But Raymond Whitaker had seen the silhouette behind that swinging lantern before it vanished, thrown black against the glass in a flash of lightning, and it had not belonged to any man. It had belonged to a woman with her hair torn loose from its pins, standing at the very edge of the gallery rail as though she did not fear the height at all, only feared what would happen if her light went dark a moment too long. He did not yet know her name. He did not know that she had just risked a beating, or worse, to save his ship and every soul aboard her. He only knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had spent his whole life reading water, that whoever she was, she understood that reef better than any government chart, and that he owed her his life. It would be 3 days before he learned her name was Maude Talmadge, and 3 months before he understood that the woman who had saved him was also the loneliest, most dangerous secret on that entire stretch of California coast. To understand how Raymond Whitaker came to be fighting for his life on that reef in the autumn of 1876, one had to go back to the spring, when the Northern Star was still whole, and his heart still closed as a ship's hold battened down against weather. He had been born in Bandon, on the Oregon coast, the second son of a shipbuilder, and he had gone to sea at 14, because the smell of pitch and rope had always felt more like home to him than any house built on solid ground. His older brother Thomas had captained his own schooner by 25, a golden boy of the coastal lumber trade, admired from Eureka to San Francisco. Then, on a black November night 8 years past, Thomas's ship had struck an uncharted shoal off Point Arena in a storm not unlike the one that had nearly claimed the Northern Star, and the sea had taken him along with all 6 of his crew. Raymond had spent the years since building a reputation as the most cautious captain on the coast, a man who studied every chart twice and trusted no light he had not personally verified. He had never married. He told himself it was because the sea left no room for a wife, but the truth, buried deep as ballast stone, was that he had watched grief hollow out his own mother when his brother did not come home, and he had sworn he would never hand that same grief to another woman who might love him. He ran lumber and general cargo for the Mendocino Coast Shipping Company, moving redwood and supplies between the small chute towns that clung to that wild shoreline like barnacles to a hull, towns with no proper harbors at all, where ships loaded lumber by cable and wire chute strung out over crashing surf, a method as dangerous as it was ingenious. Blackwater Cove was one such town, smaller than most, known up and down the coast for 2 things: the fine quality of its redwood and the terrible number of ships that had come to grief on the reef just off its point. He had heard the stories in every port from Crescent City to San Francisco. Blackwater's reef had claimed 11 vessels in 9 years, an extraordinary number even for that unforgiving coast, and the underwriters in San Francisco had begun to speak of the cove as cursed, as though the rocks themselves hungered for wood and canvas. Some captains refused cargo runs there altogether. Raymond had always told himself the wrecks were simple bad luck, poor charts, inexperienced masters unfamiliar with the currents. He had never once considered that the losses might be the design of men, not the whim of the sea, until the night the lantern spoke to him in a code that saved his ship. The morning after the storm, the Northern Star limped into Blackwater Cove under a sky scrubbed clean and impossibly blue, her foremast cracked, her rigging in tatters, but her hull, by grace and a stranger's warning, intact. Raymond stood at the rail as they came in past the very reef that had nearly killed them, and in the gentle light of day it looked almost harmless, dark humps of rock softened by foam, gulls wheeling lazily above where death had waited only hours before. The lighthouse stood tall and white above the cove, its lantern room catching the morning sun like a jewel. Raymond studied it for a long moment, remembering the woman's silhouette, the swinging lantern, the code she had flashed with such desperate precision. He meant to find her. He told himself it was only to offer his thanks, and perhaps, if he was honest with himself, to satisfy his own disbelief that any keeper's household could produce such skill. He did not yet know that the keeper's household held a secret far darker than a wife who understood signal lanterns. Blackwater Cove was a modest settlement of perhaps 300 souls, strung along a crescent of black sand beneath cliffs thick with redwood and fir. A single dusty street ran the length of it, holding a general store, a saloon called the Whistling Buoy, a small church with a bell that rang for services and funerals both, and a scattering of clapboard houses climbing the hillside like steps. The wire chute for loading lumber jutted out over the water at the north end of the cove, a marvel of cable and pulley that let ships load without ever entering a proper harbor, since none existed there. It was a hard place, built by hard people, and Raymond, once his ship was secured to the mooring buoy and his crew set to repairs, walked its single street with the particular soreness of a man who had stared death in the face and come away only bruised. He found the harbormaster's shed near the chute and asked after the keeper of Blackwater Light. Silas Talmadge, the harbormaster said, a weathered man named Otis Fenwick who chewed tobacco with the steady rhythm of a man who had chewed it his whole life and intended to keep on. Been keeper here going on 6 years now. Government appointment, though how he keeps it I sometimes wonder. Something in Fenwick's tone made Raymond look up sharply. How do you mean? Fenwick spat, considered his words, and seemed to decide against saying more to a stranger fresh off a nearly wrecked ship. Man drinks some. Ain't my business to say more. You'll want to thank him proper, I expect, for the light holding through that blow last night. Bad one, that storm. Surprised you came through at all, way that reef sits. Raymond said nothing of the swinging lantern, the the woman's silhouette. The code flashed in defiance of the light's mechanical rhythm. Some instinct, honed by years of reading currents beneath calm surfaces, told him to hold that knowledge close until he understood more. He climbed the path to the lighthouse alone that afternoon, boots crunching on crushed shell, the wind carrying the clean, bright smell of salt and cypress. The tower rose 60 feet above the point, whitewashed brick, with a black iron gallery ringing the lantern room, and beside it stood a modest keeper's cottage with a garden struggling valiantly against salt wind. A woman was in that garden when he came around the last bend in the path, on her knees in the dark soil, pulling weeds with quick, efficient motions, and Raymond stopped walking entirely. She wore a plain gray dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, her dark hair bound back, but for a few strands the wind had claimed, and even kneeling in the dirt she carried herself with an unmistakable, coiled competence, the same quality Raymond recognized in the best helmsman he had ever sailed with, a stillness that promised sudden, sure motion when it was needed. She looked up at the sound of his boots on the shell path, and her eyes, gray-green as the sea before a squall, fixed on him with open, unashamed appraisal. "You'll be the captain of that schooner that came in this morning," she said. It was not a question. "Raymond Whitaker," he said, removing his hat, "captain of the Northern Star. I came to thank the keeper for the light holding through last night's storm. I understand it was a close thing." Something flickered across her face there and gone so fast he almost missed it, a wariness like a door closing. "You'll find my husband at the Whistling Buoy most afternoons," she said, rising and brushing dirt from her skirts. "I am Maude Talmadge. I keep his house and his garden, Captain Whitaker, nothing more." But her eyes did not match her words. Her eyes, when she said nothing more, carried a challenge, as though daring him to contradict her, and Raymond, who had built his entire career on reading the truth beneath a deceptive surface, understood in that instant that the woman standing before him was not merely a keeper's wife who tended vegetables. "That storm was a bad one," he said carefully, watching her face. "The light did something strange partway through, flashed out of pattern for a spell. I confess I've never seen the like." He watched her go very still, the way water goes still just before it breaks over rock. "Storms play tricks with a man's eyes," she said. "Lightning, rain on the glass. It is easy to imagine a pattern that was never there." "I've sailed this coast 11 years, Raymond said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "I know the difference between weather and a signal, Mrs. Talmadge. Someone flashed me a message last night. 3 short, 2 long, a pause, 3 short again. It read as plain as any semaphore I ever learned in the Navy signal book. It told me to come hard to port, and it was right, because there was a tooth of rock waiting exactly where my heading would have carried me otherwise." For a long moment neither of them spoke, the wind moving through the cypress, gulls crying somewhere below the cliff. When Maude finally spoke, her voice had dropped low, urgent, and entirely different from the flat politeness she had offered before. "If you value my safety, Captain, you will speak of this to no one. Not to Fenwick, not to my husband, not to another living soul in this cove." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the mark of a woman who had not slept properly in longer than one night. "You are alive because I could not stand at that rail and watch another ship break apart on rocks I know better than any chart drawn by the government surveyors who spent one summer here and called the job finished. That is all you need to understand." "Then let me understand more," Raymond said, and he was surprised by his own insistence, by the way something in him refused to simply walk away and accept the easy answer. "My ship needs repairs. I'll be in this cove 3 weeks at the least. I mean to know why a keeper's wife stands the watch her husband is paid to stand, and why she is afraid to say so." Maude studied him for a long moment, and something in her calculation seemed to shift, some private ledger balancing toward a decision. 3 weeks, she said softly, almost to herself. "Come to the tower tomorrow at first light, Captain Whitaker, if you truly wish to understand. Come alone and come quiet. What I have to show you is not safe knowledge for careless ears." She turned back to her garden without another word, and Raymond walked back down the path to the cove with his mind churning like a sea before a gale, already certain that he had stumbled onto something far larger and far more dangerous than a single stormy night. That evening he took his supper at the Whistling Buoy, and there he got his first look at Maude Talmadge, keeper of Blackwater Light. The man sat at the end of the bar, a heavy-set fellow gone soft in the middle, with the broken-veined nose and yellowed eyes of a man who had made whiskey a permanent fixture of his days. He laughed too loud at his own jokes and bought rounds he likely could not afford on a keeper's modest government salary, and the barkeep, a wiry man named Purdy, watched him with the careful, patient tolerance of a man serving a customer he privately despised. "Keeper Talmadge," Raymond said, sliding onto the neighboring stool. "Raymond Whitaker, captain of the Northern Star. I wanted to thank you for the light last night. Rough weather to be standing watch." Maude turned bleary eyes toward him and grinned, showing a gold tooth among several missing ones. "That's the job, Captain. Blackwater Light never fails, not on my watch. 11 ships wrecked on that reef before I took the post, you know. Not one since. Not one." He said it with a strange, boastful pride that did not match the shaking of his hands around his glass. Raymond thought of the woman in the garden, her eyes carrying a warning, her silhouette against the storm-lashed glass, and he understood in that moment, with a cold certainty settling into his stomach, that Maude Talmadge was lying, and that he likely believed his own lie because he had been too drunk the night before to know that his wife had stood the watch he claimed as his own triumph. 11 ships, Raymond said slowly. "That's a great many before your time." "Bad luck coast," Maude said, waving a hand. "Government don't care to admit their surveys was faulty. Easier to blame bad luck than bad charts." He laughed again, that same too loud laugh, and called for another whiskey, and Raymond sat beside him another quarter-hour making idle talk about lumber prices and weather, all the while watching the man's hands, his eyes, the particular way he avoided any direct question about the reef's exact hazards, and filing away every detail like a navigator plotting a dangerous course. He climbed the path to the lighthouse before dawn the next morning, the sky still holding its last stars, the air cold and sharp with the smell of low tide. Maude was waiting for him at the base of the tower, a shawl wrapped tight against the chill, a lantern of her own held low so its light would not carry far. "My husband sleeps until near noon most days," she said without preamble, leading him toward the tower door. "The drink takes him hard and harder as the years pass. I have kept this light alone, in truth, for the better part of 4 years, though the government pays his name for the work my hands do." She led him up the spiral iron stairs, her steps quick and sure in the darkness, clearly a path she had walked 1,000 times, and Raymond followed with his hand trailing the cold rail, marveling at how easily she moved through a space he found disorienting in the dim light. At the top, the lantern room opened around them, the great Fresnel lens catching the first gray light of dawn and scattering it into 100 prisms across the whitewashed walls. Maude crossed to a small locked cabinet built into the base of the lens housing, produced a key from a chain hidden beneath her collar, and drew out a leather portfolio, worn soft at the corners, tied with cord. "My father was Josiah Hale," she said, setting the portfolio on the small chart table bolted to the floor. "Captain of the whaling ship Providence out of New Bedford, 30 years a master, and before that a navigator in the United States Navy Signal Corps. He had no sons who lived past infancy, Captain Whitaker, and so he taught his daughter instead. Celestial navigation, tidal calculation, sounding and charting, semaphore and signal code. Everything a man learns to command a ship, I learned at his knee, sailing with him from the time I was 8 years old until his health failed and we came ashore when I was 17. She untied the cord and opened the portfolio, and Raymond found himself looking down at a chart of Blackwater Reef so detailed, so meticulously rendered in fine ink hatching, that it made the government survey chart folded in his own sea chest look like a child's crude sketch by comparison. Depths were marked in careful fathoms at intervals no more than 20 feet apart. Current patterns were noted in flowing arrows for each tidal stage. A dangerous secondary shoal, one Raymond had never seen marked on any chart he had ever consulted, was drawn in precise detail just north of the main reef line, with a notation in small, careful script. Uncharted by government survey, discovered by sounding, June 1873, depth 2 fathoms at low water, invisible at all but the lowest tides. "That shoal there," Maude said, her finger resting on the very feature that had nearly claimed the Northern Star, "has taken 4 ships that I know of, 3 before I discovered it and 1 after, when a captain refused to trust a woman's chart over the government survey he had paid good money for. I took those soundings myself, Captain Whitaker, alone in a rowboat at first light on the calmest days I could find, over the course of 2 summers, because I could not stand to watch one more ship break apart on rocks that could be charted, could be known, could be avoided, if only someone troubled to do the honest work of measuring them." Raymond stared at the chart, then at the woman before him, and felt something shift inside his chest that he could not immediately name. He had sailed with men who called themselves master navigators who could not have produced work of this precision if given a full year, and the resources of the Coast Survey itself. He thought of every captain he had ever known who dismissed a woman's knowledge of the sea as impossible by nature, and he felt something between shame and wonder settle into his bones. "You took these soundings alone," he said slowly, "in a rowboat over that reef." "On the calmest mornings at the lowest tides, when the current runs slack for perhaps 40 minutes before it turns," she said, as though this were the most reasonable thing in the world. "I marked my position by triangulating against the tower and 2 fixed points on the headland, exactly as my father taught me. It is not difficult work, Captain Whitaker, only patient and precise, and terribly dull if you have no love for numbers." "Not difficult," Raymond repeated, and then, despite himself, despite 11 years of careful reserve, he laughed, a short, astonished sound that seemed to surprise them both. "Mrs. Talmadge, I have sailed with 3 separate masters who held certificates from the finest maritime academies on the eastern seaboard, and not one of them could sound a reef and triangulate a position without an entire crew and half a day's labor. You did this alone, in secret, because your husband could not be trusted to do his own job, and you speak of it as though it were mending a hem." Something in Maude's careful composure cracked then, just slightly, a flush rising in her cheeks that was not entirely from the cold morning air. "It was necessary," she said more quietly. "That is all. Ships would have wrecked otherwise. Men would have died. I could not simply stand by." "No," Raymond said, looking at her now with an entirely different quality of attention than he had brought to their first meeting in the garden. "I don't imagine you could." He realized with the particular clarity of a man whose entire worldview had just been quietly and thoroughly overturned, completely and helplessly impressed, and beneath that impression, something warmer and far more dangerous was already beginning to stir. The 3 weeks that followed while the Northern Star's foremast was repaired became, for Raymond Whitaker, a slow unraveling of every careful wall he had built around his heart since his brother's death. He found reasons to walk the point path nearly every day, and Maude, for her part, found reasons to be in the garden or at the tower door when he came, though they both maintained the careful fiction that these meetings were accidental. She showed him more of her father's teachings, sharing calculations for lunar distance that could fix a ship's longitude without a chronometer, a skill even Raymond, for all his years at sea, had never fully mastered. He brought her charts from ports up and down the coast, and she pored over them with the hungry attention of a woman starved for exactly this kind of intellectual company, marking corrections in the margins with a confidence that made Raymond's chest ache with a feeling he was slow to name. He learned, in pieces, the shape of her marriage. She had married Silas Talmadge at 19, 3 years after her father's death had left her without protector or income in a world that offered few honest paths for an unmarried woman with no family. Silas had seemed steady then, a junior keeper's assistant with a government appointment pending, a respectable match by every measure society offered her. The drinking had come slowly, a glass here, a bottle there, until it consumed him entirely, and with it had gone whatever gentleness he had once possessed. He had never struck her, she told Raymond one gray afternoon on the point, her voice carefully flat in the way of someone reciting facts too painful to feel directly. But he had broken things, dishes, a chair her father had made. Once, in a rage over money lost at cards, the barometer that had hung in her father's cabin for 20 years smashed against the cottage wall. "Why do you stay?" Raymond asked, though even as he said it he knew the question was cruelly simple for a woman with no family, no independent income, and a legal system that offered a wife almost no protection or recourse against a husband who did not beat her but merely broke her spirit by slow degrees. "Where would I go, Captain Whitaker?" Maude asked, not bitterly, but with the weary clarity of a woman who had already exhausted every possibility in her own mind 100 times over. "I have no family left living. A woman who leaves her husband in this country becomes a scandal, unemployable, unmarriageable, dependent on charity or worse. I stay because the light must be kept, and because leaving would mean abandoning the one purpose that gives my days any meaning at all." Raymond said nothing for a long while, watching the gulls wheel above the reef, feeling something like anger and grief tangled together in his chest. Anger at a world that trapped a woman of her extraordinary capability in such a narrow, suffocating cage, grief that he could offer her nothing but understanding, since she was another man's wife and he was, whatever he might be feeling, a man of some honor. But honor, he was discovering, was a harder thing to hold on to with each passing day in Maude Talmadge's company. It was during the second week that Raymond began to notice other things wrong about Blackwater Cove, things beyond one drunk keeper and his secretly capable wife. He noticed that Otis Fenwick kept unusually detailed records of every ship that entered the cove, records shared, he learned by careful questioning, with a merchant named Horace Prout who ran the general store, and also, it turned out, held the local agency for 2 different marine insurance underwriters based in San Francisco. He noticed that Prout seemed to know an unusual amount about cargo manifests before ships even arrived, and that Silas Talmadge spent a great deal of time in Prout's back office, emerging with money in his pocket that no keeper's modest salary could explain. He mentioned this to Maude on the 18th day of his stay, as they stood together in the lantern room while she cleaned the great lens with the careful, practiced attention of a woman tending something sacred. "Prout," Maude said, and her hands went still on the glass. "Yes, I have wondered about Prout for some time now." "Wondered what exactly?" She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, as though even within the stone walls of the tower she feared being overheard. 4 of the 11 wrecks before I took over the true keeping of this light happened during storms when Silas was, by his own drunken admission the following morning, entirely unconscious in his bed. 4 wrecks, Captain Whitaker, with no one tending the light at all, and yet in every case, Prout's insurance clients recovered handsome settlements and salvage rights to the wreckage, which Prout then sold at considerable profit, went conveniently to a company he happens to hold shares in under his brother-in-law's name in Fort Bragg. Raymond felt the cold certainty of it settle over him like a wave breaking over the bow. "You believe the light was deliberately left dark?" "I believe," Maude said, "that Horace Prout has found it profitable to encourage my husband's weaknesses, to see that he is kept drunk and insensible on nights when storms are expected and valuable cargo is due, and to collect the considerable rewards that follow when ships wreck on a reef that a competent keeper, properly sober, could easily help them avoid. I have no proof beyond suspicion and coincidence, Captain Whitaker." But I have kept this light faithfully for 4 years specifically, because I could not bear to test my suspicion by allowing even one more ship to be sacrificed to it." "My God," Raymond said softly, understanding now the full weight of what she had been carrying alone, in secret for years, the terrible burden of suspecting a conspiracy she could not prove, could not report without endangering herself, and could only counteract through her own quiet, relentless vigilance. "Maude, this is not a burden any person should carry alone." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she looked up at him sharply, something raw and unguarded passing across her face before she looked away toward the sea. "I have had no choice but to carry it alone," she said. "Until now." The word hung between them, heavy with implication, and Raymond understood that some threshold had just been crossed that neither of them could easily uncross. The Northern Star's repairs were completed by the third week's end, and Raymond found himself inventing reasons to delay his departure that grew progressively less convincing even to himself. He told Jed Coombs the rigging needed additional inspection. He told the shipping company's local agent that he wished to study the reef's currents more thoroughly before risking another loaded run through the cove. All of it was true in its narrow particulars and entirely false in its essential purpose, which was that Raymond Whitaker, a man who had spent 11 years building walls against exactly this feeling, had fallen in love with another man's wife, and could not bring himself to sail away and leave her alone with her burden and her drunken, possibly criminal husband. The moment he understood the full depth of it came on an evening in late September, when he found Maude at the tower during a lull between the evening's chores, sitting on the small bench in the lantern room with her father's old portfolio open across her knees, tracing the lines of the reef chart with an absent finger while she stared out at a sea gone gold and rose with sunset. "I used to imagine," she said, not looking up as he entered, "that I would go to sea myself one day. Foolish, I know. My father used to say that if I had been born a son, I would have made the finest navigator in the Navy's signal corps, better than any officer he served beside. I used to believe him." "I believe him too," Raymond said, and meant it entirely. She looked up then, and something in her gray-green eyes, tired and fierce and lonely all at once, undid the last of his careful reserve. "You should not say such things to me, Captain Whitaker." "Raymond," he said quietly, "after what you have shown me, after what you have done for my ship and my crew, I think you have earned the right to call me by my given name at least." "Raymond," she said, testing the word, and something in the way she said it, soft and careful, as though handling something precious, made his heart turn over entirely in his chest. "You should not say such things to me, Raymond, because I am another man's wife, and because I have spent 4 years learning exactly how much a woman loses when she allows herself to want what she cannot honorably have." "I know what you are," Raymond said. "I have known it since the moment I saw your lantern swinging through that storm, and I have spent every day since fighting a losing battle against what I feel for you. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise, and I will not press you for anything you cannot honorably give. But I will not sail away and leave you here alone with a man who breaks the things you love and a merchant who profits from other men's deaths, without at least telling you the truth, which is that I have never in my life met a person, man or woman, who commanded my respect and my heart as completely as you do." The lantern room was silent except for the soft creak of the tower in the wind and the distant sigh of waves against the reef below. Maude closed her father's portfolio slowly, her hands trembling slightly, and when she looked up at Raymond her eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. "I have not allowed myself to want anything for so long," she said, "that I hardly know how to begin now." Raymond crossed the small room and knelt before the bench, taking her hands in his, careful and gentle as though she were something rare he feared to break. "Then let us begin slowly," he said. "I am not asking you to do anything dishonorable, Maude. I am asking only that you know you are not alone anymore in the light or in anything else. Whatever comes, however long it takes, I intend to see this through with you." She did not pull her hands away, and in the golden light of that dying sunset, with the great lens beginning its patient nightly turn above them, something unspoken but entirely understood passed between them, a promise neither could yet voice aloud, but both felt settle into their bones like ballast finding its true weight. The days that followed carried a new tension, sweet and terrible in equal measure, the kind that comes when two people who love each other must guard every word and every glance against a watching world. Raymond delayed his departure yet again, taking on local cargo runs along the coast that kept him circling back to Blackwater Cove every 10 days or so, and Maude continued her secret keeping of the light while outwardly maintaining the fiction of a dutiful keeper's wife. But secrets, however carefully guarded, have a way of surfacing when the pressure beneath them grows too great, and the pressure in Blackwater Cove was building toward a storm far more dangerous than any that came off the Pacific. It was Jed Coombs who first brought Raymond troubling news, having struck up a friendship with a young dockhand named Tommy Yates who worked loading lumber onto the wire chute, and who had, in the loose talk of a boy eager to seem important, mentioned that Mr. Prout was expecting something big before winter set in proper, a ship called the Golden Crescent, a steam packet running up from San Francisco carrying, among its general cargo, a substantial payroll shipment bound for the mining operations inland, gold coin packed in strongboxes bound for the Bank of Mendocino County. He said Prout's been asking round about weather patterns for early November, Jed told Raymond aboard the Northern Star, keeping his voice low though they stood alone on deck. Asking Otis Fenwick real particular about what kind of storms usually blow through this time of year, and whether the keeper's been reliable of late. Struck me odd, Captain. Why would a storekeeper care so much about a keeper's reliability, unless he had some stake in whether that light held steady or not? Raymond felt the cold certainty he had been building for weeks solidify into something sharp and urgent. A steam packet carrying a substantial gold payroll, due sometime in early November, with a merchant asking pointed questions about storm patterns and the keeper's reliability. It was not proof, not the kind a court of law would accept, but it was enough to know that time had grown suddenly, dangerously short. He climbed the point path that evening at a pace that left him breathing hard by the time he reached the cottage, and found Maude in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, an expression of pleased surprise crossing her face at his unexpected visit before she read the urgency in his eyes and set down the bowl she carried. "What has happened?" He told her everything Jed had relayed, watching her face pale as the pieces clicked into place with the same swift precision she brought to every navigational calculation. "The Golden Crescent," she said softly. "I know that ship. She has run this coast for 3 years, always well handled, a careful captain. If Prout means to see her wrecked for the payroll aboard her, he will need a storm bad enough to explain the loss convincingly, and a light that fails at precisely the wrong moment." "He will need Sela's incapacitated," Raymond said, "and he will need you unable or unwilling to do what you have always done." Maude's jaw set in a hard, determined line that Raymond had come to recognize as the expression she wore when some difficult calculation had resolved itself into an unavoidable course of action. "Then he will be disappointed," she said. "Whatever happens, whatever it costs me, I will not let that ship break on my reef while I have breath left to signal against it." "Maude," Raymond said, taking her flour-dusted hands in his own, "if Prout suspects for even a moment that you have been the one truly keeping this light, that you know his scheme, he will not hesitate to see you silenced. A man who profits from other men's deaths will not balk at one more if it protects him from the noose." "I have known that risk for 4 years, Raymond," Maude said, and her eyes, when they met his, held no fear at all, only a fierce, unshakable resolve that made his heart ache with love and terror in equal measure. "I have simply never before had someone standing beside me who knew the truth of it. That, I find, makes the risk considerably easier to bear." They spent the following days in careful, urgent preparation. Maude began keeping a written record of every suspicious detail she could recall: dates of wrecks, conversations overheard, discrepancies in the keeper's log that Silas had never noticed. She quietly corrected each morning before the government inspector's rare visits. Raymond sent a carefully worded letter to a former Navy colleague, now serving as a customs inspector in San Francisco, describing the pattern of wrecks and the insurance settlements without naming names, hoping to plant a seed of official suspicion that might bear fruit before it was too late. But the storm, when it came, arrived faster than any of their careful preparations had accounted for. It began on the 3rd of November, a low, greenish sky rolling in off the Pacific that even Raymond, with all his years of weather reading, recognized as something dangerous gathering strength offshore. By afternoon, the wind had risen to a steady gale, and word reached the cove by rider from the telegraph station at Fort Bragg that the Golden Crescent had been sighted running before the weather, attempting to reach the shelter of Blackwater Cove's lee before the full fury of the storm arrived, her captain evidently judging the risk of the reef preferable to riding out such weather in open water. Raymond found Maude at the tower as the first heavy rain began to lash the point, and one look at her face told him she had already reached the same terrible conclusion he had. "Where is Silas?" he asked. "At the Whistling Buoy," she said grimly, and by Purdy's account, 3 sheets to the wind already, on Whiskey Pruett himself was seen buying him not 2 hours past. The pattern was unmistakable now, laid bare with brutal clarity. The keeper incapacitated by design. The gold ship running for shelter directly into the jaws of a reef that had claimed 11 vessels before Maude's secret vigilance had stopped the count. And somewhere in that raging dark, Horace Pruett waiting, Raymond had no doubt, for news of a wreck that would fill his pockets with insurance money and salvage rights, while good men drowned for his profit. "I will keep the light," Maude said, already climbing toward the lantern room, her voice steady despite the wind now screaming around the tower's stone walls. "But the light alone may not be enough, Raymond. If that ship's captain does not trust an unfamiliar signal pattern from an unknown source, if he holds to a heading he believes safe based on faulty government charts, all my warnings will count for nothing. Someone must go out and guide her directly, someone who can be seen and trusted as a legitimate maritime authority." Raymond understood immediately what she meant and felt his stomach drop with the weight of it. "You mean to take a boat out onto that reef in this?" "I mean for us to try everything within our power to save that ship and every soul aboard her," Maude said, fixing him with a look that brooked no argument. "Because the alternative is standing here safe and dry while men drown for Horace Pruett's greed. And I have already told you, Raymond Whitaker, that I will not allow that to happen while I have breath left in me." It was at that moment that the tower door crashed open behind them, and Silas Talmadge stumbled into the lantern room, his eyes bloodshot but not, Raymond realized with a fresh chill, nearly as drunk as they had believed. In his hand he held a revolver, and behind the drink-fogged confusion in his gaze was something harder and more calculating that Raymond had not expected to see. "Pruett sent me up," Silas said, his words slurred but his aim, as he leveled the revolver toward them, disturbingly steady. "Said there might be trouble tonight. Said my wife's been keeping secrets from her own husband. Is that true, Maude? Have you been up here every storm, playing at being keeper while I take the blame for whatever happens?" "Silas, put that down," Maude said, her voice remarkably calm though Raymond could see the tension coiled through her entire body. "There is a ship out there about to be wrecked for Pruett's profit, and men will die if the light fails tonight." "Men have died before," Silas said, and there was something broken and desperate in his voice now, the sound of a man who had traded whatever conscience he once possessed for enough whiskey money to drown the knowledge of what he had become. "Pruett pays well for a keeper who knows when to look the other way. I never asked what happened to the ships, Maude. I just took the money and didn't ask." "And now you're pointing a gun at your own wife to protect that arrangement," Raymond said, stepping deliberately between Silas and Maude, his heart pounding but his voice level, the voice he used to command a ship through danger. "Is that the man you've become, Talmadge? A man who trades other men's lives and now his own wife's safety for whiskey money?" Something in Silas's face crumpled at that. Some last fragment of the man he might once have been surfacing through the fog of drink and guilt and years of slow corruption. And for one terrible, suspended moment, Raymond thought the confrontation might resolve without violence. Then the tower shuddered under a tremendous gust of wind, the whole structure groaning with the force of the storm outside, and Silas, already unsteady on his feet, staggered against the chart table. The revolver discharged with a deafening crack that seemed to fill the entire lantern room, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the wooden ceiling beam. And in the chaos of the moment, as Raymond lunged forward to wrestle the weapon away, Silas stumbled backward toward the gallery door, which stood open to the screaming storm outside, caught his boot heel on the threshold, and pitched backward through it into the black, rain-lashed night. His scream was swallowed almost instantly by the wind and the roar of the sea below. Raymond rushed to the gallery rail, Maude a heartbeat behind him, and together they stared down into the churning darkness where the tower's own light, sweeping its patient arc, briefly illuminated the white foam breaking against the rocks 60 feet below, and nothing else, no sign at all of the man who had fallen. Maude's face, in that moment, held a terrible complexity of grief and horror, and something that was not quite relief but stood adjacent to it. The exhausted release of a woman who had feared this man for years and now watched the fear resolve itself in tragedy rather than triumph. "There is nothing we can do for him now," she said, her voice shaking but her mind, Raymond could see, already turning with fierce discipline toward the more immediate crisis. "But there is still a ship out there, Raymond, and she needs us now more than ever." Raymond took one last look into the churning dark below, said a silent, complicated prayer for a man whose sins had been many but whose death he had not wished, and turned back to face the storm's true purpose that night. "Tell me what you need," he said. "The light must hold its proper pattern without fail," Maude said, already moving to check the great lens's mechanism with swift, practiced hands. "That much I can manage alone. But the Golden Crescent's captain will be watching for the light and trusting his charts that do not show the secondary shoal. If he holds a heading based on those faulty charts, the light alone will not save him, because he will believe himself already past the danger when he is not." "Then I go out to warn him directly," Raymond said, understanding now what she required of him. "In this sea, in a rowboat, you would not survive the surf break alone," Maude said sharply. "But there is the old signal boat. The harbor pilot's launch Fenwick keeps moored below the chute, small enough to handle in close water, sturdy enough to survive if handled with skill. I know that boat, Raymond. I know exactly where the safe channel runs between the reef teeth, the one path a boat with a shallow enough draft can follow even at the storm's worst. I have sounded it myself a dozen times." "You cannot mean to come with me," Raymond said, though even as he spoke the words he understood, with a sinking, humbled certainty, that of course she meant exactly that, and that he had no right and no true desire to refuse her. "I mean exactly that," Maude said, already reaching for an oilskin coat hanging by the tower door. "You know how to handle a boat in heavy water, Raymond, better than almost any man on this coast, I would wager. But you do not know this reef, not truly, not the way I know it. I can read this water in the dark better than any chart could show you, because I have spent 4 years memorizing every tooth and channel with my own hands and my own eyes. You need a navigator who knows the reef, Raymond Whitaker, and I am the only living soul who does." There was no argument to make against such plain, undeniable truth, and Raymond, understanding at last and completely the full measure of the woman he loved, only nodded and reached for his own coat. "Then let us go save that ship together," he said, "captain and navigator both." They fought their way down the tower stairs and along the storm-lashed path to the small dock below the chute, where Fenwick's pilot launch strained against her mooring lines like a living thing eager to be free. The sea beyond the point was a churning chaos of white water and black troughs, the wind screaming a constant, deafening note. But Maude moved through it all with the calm, focused precision of a woman who had trained her entire life for exactly this moment. Checking the launch's small mast and sail, testing the tiller, calling out instructions to Raymond with a clarity that cut cleanly through the storm's roar. "Bear northwest by north until I say otherwise," she called out as they cleared the mooring, and the launch surged into open water, spray immediately soaking them both to the skin. The main channel runs true there for perhaps 200 yards before the first bend. Raymond obeyed without question, his hands sure on the tiller despite the wild pitching of the small boat, and felt, even in the midst of mortal danger, a fierce exhilaration at working in perfect concert with a partner who matched his own skill so completely. Ahead of them through the driving rain, the lights of the Golden Crescent came gradually into view, running lanterns swinging wildly as she fought the same storm, her captain evidently attempting to hold a position that would let her thread the passage into the cove's shelter. "There," Maude called, pointing through the spray toward a stretch of water that looked, to Raymond's eye, entirely identical to the water surrounding it. "The secondary shoal lies dead ahead of her present heading, no more than 400 yards. If she holds this course another 2 minutes, she strikes. How do we warn her in time?" Maude was already reaching for the small signal lantern stowed in the launch's bow, striking a match with hands that did not shake despite the boat's violent pitching, sheltering the flame with practiced skill until the wick caught and held. "The same code that saved you, Raymond," she said, and there was something almost like fierce joy in her voice now, the joy of a woman finally able to use every skill she possessed in the full light of another's trust and respect. "3 short, 2 long, hard to starboard, hold new heading. Bring us close enough that her lookout cannot fail to see it." Raymond fought the tiller, bringing the small launch as close alongside the great steam packet's course as he dared, close enough that he could hear her engines laboring against the sea, close enough to see figures moving on her deck and the light spilling from her wheelhouse windows. Maude stood in the pitching bow, one hand gripping the mast for balance, and swung her lantern in the same desperate, precise arc she had used to save the Northern Star weeks before. For a terrible, suspended moment, nothing happened, the great ship holding her heading, and Raymond's heart seized with the fear that they had come too late, that their small light would go unnoticed against the storm's fury, and hundreds of tons of steel and human lives would be lost to a reef that greed had turned into a killing ground. Then the Golden Crescent's own signal lamp flashed back. Once, twice, an acknowledgement, and her great hull began, with agonizing slowness, to swing away from the fatal heading, her captain trusting a stranger's warning in the dark rather than his own faulty charts, exactly as Raymond himself had done weeks before. "She's turning," Raymond shouted, exhilaration and relief crashing through him in equal measure. "Maude, she's turning." The packet's new heading carried her wide around the hidden shoal, close enough that Raymond could see white water breaking over rocks just where her original course would have carried her. And then, gradually, she found the true channel Maude had marked years before with her own patient, solitary soundings, and steamed safely into the lee of the point, her whistle sounding 3 long blasts of acknowledgement and gratitude into the storm-torn night. They brought the small launch back to the dock exhausted, soaked through, shaking with cold and spent adrenaline in equal measure, but alive, and behind them, safe in the cove's shelter, the Golden Crescent rode out the remainder of the storm with her cargo and her crew and her passengers entirely intact, saved by a woman the world had never once thought to ask what she knew about the sea. Raymond helped Maude up onto the dock, and for a long moment they simply stood there in the driving rain, foreheads nearly touching, both of them laughing with the particular giddy relief of people who have stared death directly in the face and walked away whole. "You saved that ship," Raymond said, cupping her rain-soaked face in his hands. You saved every soul aboard her, Maude. I have never in my life witnessed anything so extraordinary." "We saved her," Maude corrected, though her eyes shone with an emotion that went far beyond professional pride. "Captain and Navigator, exactly as you said." And there, on the storm-lashed dock with the Golden Crescent's grateful whistle still echoing across the cove, Raymond Whitaker kissed Maude Talmadge for the first time. A kiss that tasted of salt and rain, and the particular sweetness of two hearts finally free to want what they had denied themselves for so long. The days that followed brought their own complicated reckoning. Silas Talmadge's body was recovered 2 days later, washed into a small cove north of the point, and the coroner's inquest, hearing testimony from both Raymond and Maude about the confrontation in the lantern room, ruled his death an accident, a drunk man's fatal misstep in a raging storm, which was, Raymond reflected, close enough to the truth to satisfy both the law and his own conscience. Horace Prout's scheme unraveled with satisfying thoroughness once Raymond's letter to his customs inspector friend, combined with Maude's carefully kept records and the sworn testimony of the Golden Crescent's captain regarding the deliberate misdirection he had nearly sailed into, reached the proper authorities. A federal investigation into insurance fraud along the Mendocino coast, spurred by the near disaster and the mounting evidence Maude had quietly gathered across 4 dangerous years, resulted in Prout's arrest within a month, and the eventual conviction of 2 other merchants along the coast who had participated in similar schemes at other treacherous points. Maude, widowed and now entirely free of the marriage that had constrained her for 8 difficult years, found herself for the first time in her adult life answerable to no one but her own conscience and her own considerable capabilities. The Lighthouse Board, upon learning the full truth of who had actually kept Blackwater light faithfully and skillfully for the better part of 4 years, and moved by the extraordinary circumstances of the Golden Crescent's rescue, took the unusual but not unprecedented step of appointing her officially as keeper in her own right, a position she would hold, competently and proudly, for the rest of her working life. One of a small but real number of women who served as official lighthouse keepers along that wild coast in those years. Raymond, for his part, discovered that his heart, once so carefully guarded against the grief that love might eventually demand, had no interest whatsoever in returning to its old caution. He completed one final season of coastal runs for the shipping company, settling his affairs and training a capable young officer to take over command of the Northern Star. And then, in the spring of 1877, after a respectful period of mourning had passed, and Maude's own heart had found its way clear of grief and guilt alike, he asked her to marry him on the very gallery where they had first truly seen each other, the great lens turning its patient light above them both. "I have spent my whole life," Maude told him, her hands steady in his despite the tears standing bright in her eyes, "believing that my particular skills made me strange, unmarriageable, too much for any ordinary man to want. You have never once asked me to be less than exactly what I am." "I fell in love with exactly what you are," Raymond said. "I have no interest in any lesser version of you, Maude Talmadge, and I never will." They were married that June in the small church in Blackwater Cove, with Jed Coombs standing as Raymond's witness and half the cove turning out to celebrate the union of the town's new lighthouse keeper and the coastal captain who had, in the retelling that grew more dramatic with each passing year, sailed directly through the reef's teeth on nothing but faith in a stranger's signal light. Raymond took a position as harbor pilot for the Mendocino coast, work that kept him close to shore and close to home, guiding ships safely through the very waters where he and Maude had first tested their love against a killing sea. Together they raised their family in the keeper's cottage below the tower, a son first, whom they named Josiah after Maude's father, and 2 years later a daughter they named Rose, both children growing up with the particular confidence of those raised by parents who had proven, beyond any doubt, that courage and intelligence and love could triumph over even the darkest storms and the most treacherous hidden reefs. Maude taught both her children to read the stars and sound a coastline before they were old enough for formal schooling, and it became something of a local legend along that stretch of coast, the story of the lighthouse keeper's wife who had known the reef better than any government chart, and the captain who had trusted her signal in the dark when trusting a stranger meant risking everything he had. They lived long, full lives together at Blackwater Point, Raymond growing gray and weathered as harbor pilot and beloved local figure, Maude tending her light with the same fierce devotion she had always brought to the work, until the day came, decades later, when electric lighting finally replaced the old Fresnel lens, and the lighthouse board offered her, with great ceremony and genuine gratitude, a comfortable pension in recognition of one of the longest and most distinguished careers of any keeper on the entire Pacific coast. And on quiet evenings after that, when the work of tending the light no longer demanded her presence, Maude and Raymond would still climb the tower stairs together simply to watch the sun set over the water they had once crossed together in a small boat during the worst storm either of them had ever survived, hand in hand, captain and navigator still, exactly as they had promised each other on that rain-lashed dock so many years before, and exactly as they would remain, in love and in partnership, for every year of the long and happy life that followed.